Hey guys, Luke Clausen here. Today we're going to be changing out our alternator to a high output alternator kit. So Mercury makes an alternator upgrade kit that's going to take you from 85 to 115 amp output. Pretty simple to do, switch them out. It's a little over 500 bucks for the kit, so not tremendously expensive, but you're going to get a lot more output. It's going to flow back into those batteries or something like the charge system, or even just charging your cranking battery up. In the kit, it's going to come with a fuse link, which is a charge back wire going to go from the power post to the new alternator. So those are really the only two things we're going to have. We're going to show you how to switch that out here right now. Guys, so we're just getting ready to replace this high output alternator. It's an upgrade kit on our Mercury there, but I want to tell you the tools you're going to need today. One thing is this little tool. We use this here for the flywheel to spin that to get the stretch belt back on. I'm sure there's other ways to do it. This little tool I borrowed here to be able to spin that back on. You'll see in the video. With that, you need a 1 1/16 wrench to be able to twist that to spin that flywheel. And here, this is kind of interchangeable. They are 1/2 inch nuts that we're going to have on a lot of the wires, but they have a lot of spray, like electrical tape on them. It's this gooey stuff they had put on there to hold everything together. We ended up using a 13 millimeter just so it fit over it a little bit bigger, but you can use either. And lastly, 7 millimeter little driver here we just used to loosen a hose clamp. That's really all you need. It's not that complicated to do. The most important thing is being able to get that flywheel to spin, to get the belt on there. Everything else, I think we're going to be done in about 20-30 minutes, something like that today. Pretty quick, easy fix. All right, we're going to start by pulling the cowling off. Probably the easiest way to do it is off the back deck. You can use a step ladder or something like that, but to get to the top of the motor, you want to get yourself elevated here a little bit. All right, one of the first important steps is disconnecting your batteries. So I'm going to disconnect my negative posts on the side, and when we get done with that, we're going to go over here to the trim button and test it. Make sure we don't have any power going to the engine. All right, so now that we got the power disconnected, we've tested, make sure there's no power to the motor, but we're going to come underneath here, and there's a little hose clamp screw on this, so we'll loosen this up so that we can get this air intake off. Once we get that off, we'll come, and there's a hose on this other side, and we'll pull our dipstick out and set that all off to the side. All right, so now that we've got our air intake off, out of the way, we have the alternator, everything exposed here. The next thing we're going to do, we're going to pull this boot back here, and we'll take our power wire off. This is the same wire that came with the replacement, so we'll pull this wire off. And we're going to start disconnecting our alternator. So we'll pull this wire off, and we'll move to this plug here, disconnect that, and we're getting a lot closer to being off. The next thing we're going to do after we get this off here is start to remove our alternator. So we have these bolts holding it down, of course the ground, the other bolts, but remember it is connected to the belt. So when we get to that last nut, it's going to break free, it's going to pull towards us still. Not a big deal, but that is going to take place. All right, so now that we have the power cable disconnected here, we got our plug off. There's one thing in the way of the alternator still, and that's your oil fill line. So we're gonna loosen these two nuts up here, disconnect this oil fill, just swing it out of the way so we're able to lift that alternator out of there. All right, so we got our oil fill out of the way here, and now we're gonna come in and start loosening up these alternator bolts. And these are what really hold your alternator on here, and one of the last steps we're going to have before throwing the new one on. So we've gotten all of our bolts out now. Our ground wire is disconnected from the alternator, and it should be free. You'll see the belt just had the tension releases once you get that off, so we have the old alternator out now. All right, so we're ready to put the new alternator in here. I have in my hand the old one sitting here. What we're going to do is pull this belt off the front of the flywheel so it'll sit back in there, and we can set the new alternator right in where the other one was. And we'll go ahead and bolt this down, make sure that that belt is sitting there to where you can catch it with this new alternator before we get it in there. Get that up on there, and we're going to bolt this back in and go ahead and move our oil fill back over. We're not going to connect any of the wires yet other than the ground to the post that was on here before, but we're going to get that all set back in right now. All right, so we got the alternator bolted back on, our negatives back on there. We're going to go ahead and get our oil fill put back on, get our dipstick back in its holder here, and we're going to be putting the belt on shortly. All right, so now that we have everything back on here. I got the belt on the alternator, and what we're going to do, we got to spin this on with the flywheel. So we're going to pop that little cap off. This is a little tool I borrowed from a guy that helps me spin the flywheel. There's ways you can spin the flywheel, but you really need to spin the flywheel to get it on. Start that belt when it's on the alternator, start it on the flywheel on the port side of the boat here. So we're going to start it on this side, and we're going to take and twist it on. So we're going to take and use the flywheel to wrap that belt on there. All right, so now we got the belt on the flywheel. We were able to turn it on using this little tool here, turn that flywheel to get it started. Just turn it a few times and make sure that we're all good. You can see the belt on the back of the alternator here. There's a little window you can see it through there. Make sure you're on good, but just spin it a couple times and make sure we're all going in the right direction, but we should be all connected there. So now that we got the belt on, we're going to throw that cap back in the top of the flywheel, and we're really ready to replace our wire now. So we got this here. These zip ties are holding the stuff together. So we're going to cut this apart, and there's one more zip tie right down in here holding those two wires together. And it's really important when we get this done to make sure we have them secured back together again. We don't want loose wires in there. It just creates issues. Now, one little trick for doing this here, we're going to have our old wire with the boot here. We're going to take the new wire and just zip tie it to that, and that's going to save us a lot of time and headache by getting that wire down through there. We can actually just pull that through to the post where the old one was connected. So we'll just use that as a tool just to pull it through and get it back in the same little channel it was in before. So now that we got those wires zip tied together here, we're going to come down to this post up in front of the flywheel on the starboard side. You'll see this post with the red and black wires on it, and we're going to go ahead and remove these nuts. Now, they come with some liquid electrical tape type stuff on there, so it's kind of gooey, kind of hard to get a 1/2-inch wrench on there. It'll peel right off, but we're going to remove these nuts so we can get this wires off, get that post freed up for our new fuse wire to our alternator. All right, well, so we removed some of these nuts. There's 3 nuts actually on here. It's the 3rd wire in here is the one we're looking for, and you can see it run all down through there, and you can see the fuse that's on it to know that that's the same wire. So we're going to take, and we'll go ahead now that we got that off, and just pull this down through here while pulling our new wire. You kind of want to feed it and make sure you're not going to destroy anything, but it should come pretty close to through. It's you can see better than you think in here, and so we just pulled it right through there. And so now we got our new wire pulled through, and we're just going to come over here and cut this zip tie that was holding them together, get rid of that old wire. We don't need that any longer, and we're ready to put all this stuff back on the post, put it back together here before we connect the alternator. So now that we got the wire pulled, we're back to the post. We're just going to put it all back together. So there's going to be 3 wires and a nut, and then the last wire and your final washer and nut will be on the outside of this last wire here. So we have those 3 wires with the new one included, and then the big wire here after the first nut, lock washer and other nut on the outside. All right, so we're ready to start connecting our wires, but one important thing to do here is make sure we zip tie these back together the way they were. There's a reason they're zip tied together like this. We don't want wires rubbing, causing shorts, anything like that. So make sure you replace those zip ties where they were when you cut them to replace that power wire. Let's do that one on there loose is the way it was. I'll cut that end here in a second. And then come up here, and this is going to go to the post. We're going to zip tie that also to the other plug power that goes to your alternator here too. And one thing with this alternator, I realized it after the fact, but there's a little spacer on the old alternator. You're going to want to pull off your old alternator. It's just a little spacer. It's going to slide up over your threads right there, and then we're ready to go ahead and just put the nut back on and attach it the way it was before. But remember to get that little spacer off your old alternator and put it on the new one here. All right, so now we got our wires on our alternator. We got our wires zip tied back together. We're really ready just to put things back together. I've already snapped the cover on your power post here where those wires were. We're going to go ahead and get the air box and slide it up here and start throwing everything back together the way it was. Pretty well done. Really important to make sure we get this and fit over this properly. We're going to tighten our hose clamp up, but we need to make sure everything fits together properly. Hook our air line back up here, and we're getting pretty close to done. We got the air box back on. We're going to connect this line over here, just pops over it. You know, it's really important. We kind of struggled with it like this to start with, but it's really important to get that little rubber gasket around that, everything to fit properly there. You don't want to force it, be really gentle with it. And once you get that, everything else pretty much just pops over your oil fill here. And we're going to put our dipstick back in, tighten our hose clamp, and we're just about ready to get on the water to go test it and make sure it's working. So we're on the last thing here, tightening up this little hose clamp, and really pretty simple. Hopefully you guys enjoyed watching, learned how to replace that, put that high output alternator on there. It's something that, you know, I'm not gonna have to charge for days with that. It took us probably a half hour to do. We'll recap all the tools used. Really pretty simple. It took us like a half hour while we're taking time to film this stuff too. So once you do it once, it's gonna be a lot easier the second time, but definitely not something hard to do. Something that's really gonna help me on the water have a lot more power. With the charge system, it's gonna charge up trolling motor batteries, you know, but it's also gonna keep your cranking battery going all the time too. Even when you're not running around very much, you're moving from, I believe it's 85 to 115 amps coming out of that alternator. So big difference. That's a big increase in the amount of power that motor's generating and charging those batteries back up. We're gonna throw the cowling on and go test this thing out on the water.